Welcome, everyone. Grandmaster Dr. Thor Templar with another book report from an occult scientist. These book reports or reviews come from a perspective of a working, applying occult scientist. This is not just a book review from a person who is interested in the subject or just a book review in general. This is from an occult scientist viewpoint, and we're always looking for, is there something practical here that can be used and integrated into our systems? What can we learn about this in a practical nature? We also like to educate people on what the truth of the issue is. What's going on beyond just taking everything at face value and interpreting what's happening, our viewpoint from a long-term research position. For doing this for over 45 years and doing research into all areas of the occult sciences, which of course American Indian empowerments, Native Americans is part of the whole bigger picture. Now, I don't know how many people are familiar with American Indian belief systems, practices, etc. You could say this is kind of similar to Carl Castanedas's books on what would be considered a Mexican shamans or healers or sorcerers, as I'm sure Castanedas would use. So it's a very similar type interaction. Of course, those books are 100% in question because we really don't know if Carlos Castanedas had any contact with anybody. He wrote very excellent, masterful books, mostly philosophical in nature, at a time when the whole area of hallucinogen drugs was extremely big and practiced, and it's still a practice done today as people are heavily into ayahuasca and other things. But the credibility of Carlos Castanedas is in extreme doubt, but it doesn't mean that any information that he presented isn't excellent. I do enjoy his books, and I think the information, again, in the bigger picture, is excellent with him, but there's virtually nothing in his books of any value. So, practically, what we move here is we do know that this Native American, otherwise known as Rolling Thunder, his Indian name, John Pope is his Western name, was a real person and interacted with many people, including very famous people. So we know this is a real person. We have reports from him from many people who interacted with him and can give stories of healings and activities and things that he did. So this is not in any way a question of whether this person was real and what they could do. I mean, here again we have documented case after documented case by professional scientific types that is irrefutable. The main book I'm talking about right now is Rolling Thunder by Doug Boyd. This, I believe, was the first main book on him. It was written in as usual, like most of the good stuff, it goes back quite a ways. The book was first published in about 1974. The information in this book goes back into the late 60s, early 70s of the events that actually were documented by Doug Boyd, who is another person who is part of a college research program, and just as credible as anybody else in the regular scientific world, even though, of course, the book could have been documented a little better in exactly what happened, and as a researcher, in particularly that particular times and working with this person, he held Rolling Thunder in a little too much reverence instead of challenging him in different areas and getting a little better research of exactly what this guy could do. Now, he did demonstrate several different healings and with amazing results that many other people witnessed as well. There's some also very outrageous things credited to him, which the author has not proven properly because he didn't personally witness it. We'll go into some of those things, which is quite interesting. But as a general book, this goes into the basic Native American belief system, giving you an excellent introduction of how they feel about things. You know, back then in the 70s, this was a little bit new. Now it's considered common, quote, paganism, where the earth is alive and these types of, it's a living being. This is now pretty much embraced by any alternative, quote, pagan groups of people, and embraced around the world by alternative thinking people, or I should say the smart people. Only idiots think everything's are chemicals. But it's not overly new now, but I'm assuming a lot of people still don't know this. As an educated person approaching 60, I've had a lot of exposure to things with all the young people coming up that seem to know nothing. This is a good introduction to that whole area for anyone who wants to learn about the basic philosophies. It also is very interesting because it documents the horrific treatment of American Indians, and this treatment does continue today. And what is shocking is that how badly the American Indians were treated through the 1960s and into the 70s. I do remember when I was in junior high school, many articles and information about the, quote, uprisings of the American Indians on the different reservations, etc. So this was an issue, and it continued through the 70s. There was a large support for them from the growth of the people that were expanding at that time when everything was coming out and everything was being questioned. Unfortunately, most of that's been lost. But there was a lot of support. He actually had a close relationship with several movie stars, politicians, and apparently was good friends of the band members from the Grateful Dead, who raised money for him and worked with him, etc. So, this information and the horrific treatment, one of the interesting, and you know what people don't understand is while everyone was out fighting the great peril of the World War I, the Islamic German takeover of Europe, the first time in the 20th century that was attempted, there were still American Indians in prison. And people don't understand that the Indian Wars and the Indian effects and the growth of the West was going into the late 1800s all the way into the early 1900s. So this is something that, you know, we don't look at a particular time level of understanding that, you know, people think that the Wild West and the moving to the different states and the opening of the West and everything else was, you know, way, way far ago, you know, like the day of independence in 1776. But still, that's pretty new if you think about it. You know, a couple of hundred years is nothing in world history. And we're talking about, when we deal with this, we're talking about in the 60s. This was only 40, 50 years that passed major takeover and destruction of what remaining Indians there were. So, and people don't understand the horrific treatment. While there was in the 60s a huge explosion finally of liberating blacks, this procedure left the Indians behind. The Indians did not get all the benefits that a lot of these different things showed for the black people. So they were still persecuted. They still had separate bathrooms. They were being murdered left and right off of and on the reservations. I mean, these things are documented in this book, and these are all, well, if the exact instances could obviously be traced, but this is something that has been happening to Indian cultures all over the United States. Their persecution, because even though they kept being pushed onto reservations like the fake national forest and public land we have, which is basically, and a lot of the ecology groups that have been started, well, ironically, the ecology groups that have been started, the conservation societies that we look at as protectors of the environment, were started by extremely wealthy people as a way of protecting land that they wanted to use in the future. The government gives permits and is bribed and paid to allow permits of accessing government lands for business purposes. This happened quite a bit under Schwarzenegger, Arnie Schwarzenegger, who allowed all sorts of things to happen in the California national parks, so to speak, where they go in and they take things, drill for oil, cut down trees. You know, people don't understand that this land isn't 100% protected from this. People are given permits to go in and do this. And businesses made sure that this land wasn't bought by others, large corporations. They made sure this land was in control of their own controlled people, otherwise known as politicians. So that's a very interesting and I think little-known fact that most of these conservation and groups were started by wealthy business people to make sure that they had that land off to the side. They didn't have to pay taxes on it. They didn't have to maintain it. They just go in and steal everything they want because they give your political buddy, your local congressman, your local senator, that you think's great because you keep voting him in year after year, as most of these idiots in government are. Made sure that these people give them whatever they want. This book goes into a lot of the actual problems here. It's also thought that Rolling Thunder, the movies, the Billy Jack movies, which are fantastic movies, I highly recommend to purchase those, particularly with the commentaries. And he talks about how horrible the Indians are treated. I don't think too many people know that or understand that now. There's been in the last 15 or 20 years approximately growth in Indian empowerment because some of them have opened up casinos and now make billions of dollars. It's hard to say how connected these are to actual tribes. Anybody who has Indian blood can open up a casino, apparently. And of course, the Indians are so intermixed with the cultures that are around them, from the Southerners and the Southern blacks particularly in California and other places, most Indians look exactly like Mexicans. You can't tell them a difference. So there's this intermixing, so your classical red man doesn't look very red, and of course Rolling Thunder looked very Caucasian because of the interbreeding there. But few people know that particularly the Mormons were involved in government programs where they actually took Indian children, and this is in the 60s, people. This isn't the 1920s, and then indoctrinated them into Christianity and Western ways. Now, this happened in majorly known in Australia, where they did this with the Aboriginals and destroyed their culture that way. And I'm assuming for similar reasons, so they could steal their land and for the psychotic belief that their religion is so much better and didn't want people to have their own belief systems. Now, this seems foreign to a lot of people today, but this is how things work, and particularly the 60s was a big time when this was done. I believe Australia, it wasn't, by then I think these practices were stopped, but I'm not sure. They certainly did go on in mass in Australia, and apparently, unbeknownst to me, and probably very few people listening to my voice, that this was going on in the United States and was being perpetrated dramatically by the Mormons. And the Mormons, of course, have a belief system that that Jesus, their Messiah, came to this, preached to the American Indians, and there's a certain sacredness to them that they want to restore. They also believe the fact that people of color were cursed because of their evil deeds. That's why you're of color. Now, I don't know if that has to do with Indians as well, but they, as usual with the Mormons, they have an onion. But they were participating in this, saving the savages of the past and giving them back their, quote, original religion, which is based in Mormonism. So all of this was going on, and the invasion of the Indian lands were happening. They were particularly in areas where he was involved in. They were what we would call strip mining the forest, pulling all the trees down so they could allow these cattlemen to come in and use the land. And of course, we've heard many instances, these cattlemen in particular, and a whole segment of farmers are really right-wing nut jobs that are totally backed by government to abuse and steal everything at their will. So they were going on Indian territory, land, and doing this and destroying their natural things, just was happening throughout the Amazon forests to then bring cattle in. And grass grows for a year or two, and then the soil, which has not been built up to sustain that type of environment, generally turns into dust and is unusable. People think that grazing land is something that's sustainable, but it's not when it's a past, quote, rainforest. So they were coming into all these American-type rainforests or forested areas and just going in there at special things and ripping the trees out by the hundreds of thousands. Against treaties, the politicians looked the other way. Any reservation land had the typical evil police, corrupt evil police, who would harass American Indians, murder them in jails. They had no rights. Anytime they went to court, they would be easily convicted and thrown in prison. Totally against treaties and everything else. Some were arrested because they refused to go into the military, which by treaty states that they didn't have to. And I could go on and on here, and a lot of this is documented in the book, so I really recommend this. You've got to see the history of what's going on with your government and not what exactly you've been told, the nonsense, this waving of this garbage flag of freedom that never was there. It never was any freedom connected to it. It was a fake system they got you to buy into, and now everyone's paying the price with a fascist government that murders you when you do anything that they don't like. The corruption levels are unbelievable, and this really hasn't changed that much. And everyone needs to understand that the military is the strong arm of this fascist government with their buddies, the police, and these people will murder you. They came in and did this in Waco, Texas, where they brought in the military and brought in tanks and along with their fellow highly trained SWAT murderers from police departments around the United States who just get off on murdering you. That's their job. So all of this needs to be understood. It was, as the old saying goes, it was the blacks, was the Indians, now it's everybody. That's what happens when you don't take care of these problems initially. So it's very documented here, and it's very, they talk about one treaty meeting that his particular tribe went to. This was at the end of the Indian times, and they agreed, both sides, to go there unarmed. Well, what do you think happened? That's kind of a naive way of looking at things. Of course, the U.S. military showed up fully armed, brought with them a claimed robber, apparently, not even a murderer from some sort of train or something, some prisoner they brought along. They brought their guns, of course. They murdered this suspected criminal, cut him up into little pieces, cooked him, and then had the entire tribal people that had come there, which why they would bring their women and their children and everybody else to such untrustworthy people as the Americans, and then forced everybody to eat this person. How nice. Sounds like all the things that go on by the military over in the Middle East now, of how they butcher, murder, and torture people as well. And of course, they're more than happy to extend that great military training to their own people. After all, they do what they're ordered, and they're your neighbors. So the whole idea is that there are many instances of this, and this book points all of these things out, and it's nothing new. The few tribes that have made money don't seem to help the other tribes, and this has been a problem with and the book talks about this, not as it should be emphasized a lot more it is, but the book talks about how the Indians themselves are bought off and controlled by the Indian Bureau and how they worked with all the bad guys. And we know why they did this. They're all getting paid and doing other things. They basically were corrupt. So a big problem with any group of people is those traitors within their organization. So that's nothing new either, people, is it? So that's why things don't work out, because your own people. Now, the history of the Indians, without giving some sort of balance here, is that they always were killing each other tribes. So one of the reasons why the Indians were conquered as easily as they were was not because of the American military, which, by the way, was highly untrained people, very poorly organized, very poorly funded. Didn't even have proper weapons. As a matter of fact, the Indians had better rifles than most of the American military because they had the new stuff, where the military had the old junk. Sound familiar? But the point is that they murdered each other all the time and never could work together, and this was a big problem. So, what's new? I believe it was I'm trying to remember the last Geronimo, I think it was, who the American military was hunting and was able to evade them because they knew how to cross and go places where the primitive, stupid American military couldn't find them. They were finally discovered because Indians tracked them down. Their own people tracked them down and turned them into the government to be slaughtered. And their answer was, why did you? Because Geronimo asked them, why are you doing this against your people? And they said, they pay me. They give me a place to sleep and eat. How nice. So we go through all this, and of course, none of these cultures on any side are 100% pure, and the atrocities done by Indians are well documented as well. So that needs to be understood. But of course, those things weren't happening in 1960. These were people that have been conquered, were trying to live their life in their own places, and they're coming and stealing their children. They're coming on their land and destroying it, destroying their food supplies, destroying the ecological balance. It goes on and on and on. And this continued throughout the 70s into the 80s and everything else, and goes on a lot even to this day, where the smart Indian tribes took their children and sent them to law school and fought the government and eventually won in many areas. Then somebody figured out that they had a right to gambling, and now they're extremely wealthy. Now, what they're doing with their money, I have no idea. It doesn't seem like they're helping other Indians or even their own communities that much. As much as money people may think is freedom to this culture to fight and stand up and to perpetrate their own belief systems and tribal ways, most likely money is going to bring them Cadillacs, Porsches, fast food, and the annihilation of their society entirely, because they'll be, as well as having much more inter-society connection, because now they're going to be very wealthy and they'll be able to attract partners of any type. So these are all the problems that go into it, but it's a very fascinating book. Now, we want to get into the area to give you an overview at this, and I think that everyone needs that. But I want to look at this from the occult scientist perspective. What in this book shows this person was a powerful person or not? As I said, the documentation is relatively poor. There's a lot of stories, but a lot of other people besides this author worked with Rolling Thunder, and there are many, many people that have witnessed what he has done. Everything from drilling wells in a very dry place in Nevada, where he had a alternative community, and he was able to find wells there, and they had plenty of fresh water. Now you're talking about in the middle of the desert, so he was able to discover this. Also, we have to understand that he was also under great attack and pressure as well. People paid scum from the government would come there and harass him, break his cars up, murder his dogs, and in general harass him. This is documented in the book as well, as they did to American Indians in general, with the help, of course, of the local police. So all of these things are documented. So this is all part of the bigger picture. But as I said, we'll move away from the injustices here. Now, he has demonstrated great healing abilities. What's interesting is always this rub that I call, and we'll get into that as well with all these people because it is quite interesting. But this is how things work. This rub, and someday I'll do an audio on this alone, and it's very, as a researcher, disturbing of why these things happen. But it seems to be that, working in your own life is much more difficult than assisting others, and there is a reason for that. And of course, that's a whole nother discussion. But there were many cases that he actually healed people. Radically healing, doing what we consider as a general term. Basically, it's medicine man is what the Indian term is. We would call it more shamanism now, where he would suck out the negative energy, and he would do it in a physical way from a particular wound or troubled area. And this energy would be taken out, and the person would be healed relatively rapidly, sometimes almost instantly. And there's a documented case of this shown to a group of people in the book, where they did this with a person who was having a terrible leg infection or problem. Again, it's not, the actual condition isn't documented enough, and this is one of the problems with this book. But the person had this done, which they had a very painful problem, and they were unable to move after this healing. Within an hour, this person was able to play ping pong, apparently. So there are cases of this that go on. I'm sure he failed a lot as well. The documentation, in cases like this, people only remember the victories, but there's a lot of things that are questionable as well. But that's life. Not everything works out. People want alternative people to be gods. We can't fail if you're an occult scientist. You're always under test, yet your doctor has a list as long as arms, legs, and his entire body of all the patients that have died under his care, indirectly and even directly. But they're never brought to that. The fakeness of modern medicine and its huge failure rate is never brought into question. Only alternative people who are expected to produce virtually God-like powers on every single point. And if you fail once, of course, you're a fraud. But there's many interesting cases here of him showing how he generated storms. One thing that led me to this book was the research in the PK Man, who was able to create weather systems. And you're talking about large systems, lightning, thunder, large amounts of rain, which has been documented with the PK Man in Mishlov's book, which is highly recommended. He was able to do similar things like this. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to read this book, because it's pretty fascinating. And this seems to be part of shamanism in general, which of course makes sense. You're not going to ask a shaman, if you're living in a tribe, to make your IBM stock go up 100 points. You're going to need to control weather conditions, to either grow crops or to protect yourself or to bring in needed rain. These are the type of things that shamans seem to be very good at and seem to be able to do this time after time in any different tradition that they come from. This has been documented over and over again, and here's another documentation of this. So this is quite fascinating. So it's been documented to some degree. Again, the scholarship in terms of the actual recording from Doug Boyd is not very good. Stanley Krippner, the famous parapsychologist and psychologist who graduated from Northwestern University, a very noted, excellent university, worked with Rolling Thunder as well and has documented many more cases of this and healings and other things and have seen him in action. So the whole idea is that, and as well, there is very little benefit for people to do these type of things as shamans. They're not overly interested in money. They don't have a lot of money, and they bring a lot of pain upon themselves when they do things like this. As a side note here, getting back to the kidnapping of children and then brainwashing them, it's very interesting that the people that stopped this practice finally was brought to their attention and who did a lot of good work for the American Indians was Richard Nixon. President Nixon passed a lot of legislation helping and protecting the American Indians. Isn't that interesting? Here's a guy that's been demonized, and personally, I always thought Nixon, who I lived through that time, was basically a pretty good president. They went after him for nonsense in this day and age where they blow up 7 major buildings in the middle of New York City and cause wars that murder millions of people and cost tens of trillions of dollars. It's just all laughed off. That's hillbilly stuff. It's okay. Nixon, who got involved in a bizarre break-in that meant absolutely nothing to get documents that have no value, that are done every day now by computers that steal information from everybody all the time, was made into this terrible villain. He did control Vietnam. Like all presidents, there are problems with him. Apparently, Ted Kennedy brought this issue to Nixon, Ted Kennedy being a Democrat, and the Kennedys, even with their horrible reputation and the way they seem to treat individuals, have always worked very hard for the average person. Ted Kennedy tried to get national health care his entire life. He worked against the fascist bankruptcy bill that was passed by the Democrats not too long ago. So he brought this information to Nixon, and Nixon protected them and stopped that abduction and indoctrination of America. That's an interesting little side note for all those people that want to live by the gossip of who is good or who is bad. One interesting case, and of course there was one young Indian boy who refused to, and this is still during the draft time, who was arrested and thrown in prison because he refused to go in the military. Now, treaty stated that the American Indians would not be forced to fight in the military for obvious reasons. Why would anybody do that? Particularly, I've always wondered, I guess it's just a way out for them, but why any black person would fight for America is about as stupid as it gets. Of course, it is a job, and it's a way out of poverty to a degree. But how ironic it is to fight for the same system that enslaved you. And of course, the Indians were better than that, even though apparently they have been in the military at different times, particularly during World War II, where they were known as the Code. They used American Indian languages, which nobody really knew about, to speak in codes, the Navajo for communications in World War II. I don't know if those people donated their time, or I should say, I don't know if they freely enlisted or they were forced to be. Of course, when you're talking about World War II, things are quite different than the trumped up wars that have followed that. So what happened there is that he was placed in a particular prison, and of course, this enraged Rolling Thunder, as it certainly should, and he was very much of an activist and apparently seemed to work pretty much on his own. He had very little support Mad Bear, a friend of his, was one he had support with, who blended into society a little more. But there's never any talk of groups of his fellow people getting together to do things. But one of the things that apparently, in terms of this, is that he went to this prison and told them that this is illegal. I want my people back. Of course, they laughed at him, threw him out, told him that that person wasn't even there when he returned again and demanded things again. Well, he's not even here. And of course, he knew he was there. So what he did was he went out and was able to summon up, which he then brought to the actual prison, a mini tornado. This seems to be documented to some extent, and of course, if things could be traced. And of course, it's impossible for researchers to go out. I could spend hours and hours and weeks, months and months hunting all this stuff down. It's impossible to do. This is one of the problems with this book, is that there's not really enough documentation. Is this a legend? Is this a reality? But he brought up a storm, and when he brought this storm and went back to the prison, they were so freaked out that they released the person, and he was never rearrested. Certainly is fascinating. So there are endless stories of this, him working with nature, him being able to stop mosquitoes from biting him, him communicating with the coyotes so they would not eat his chickens. All the very typical shamanic things that we talk about, understand out there, and goes on and on with him doing. He also, of course, did many, many healings and many other works. And so these are documented, probably must be a few hundred of these from many different people that witnessed them. He had a community there where probably hundreds of people witnessed him doing certain things as well. He had minor support, apparently, from the Grateful Dead band, who did help him raise money. They tried to put together organizations, and interestingly, the people that headed these organizations were all bought off, corrupted, and blackmailed, probably all of that, where they stole the money, he wasn't able to get it, and of course, this goes on and on. As I've mentioned, the Billy Jack movies are based somewhat on his life and some of his activities and his militancy. These are very excellent films that have not got the credit they should. They are very excellent films. These were the first films to actually show shamanic rituals on the screen. And of course, the producer, McLaughlin, was nothing but harassed throughout his entire life, and kept out of the movie business. Money was stolen from him. He was just very smart and was able to, at a particular time, I remember when Billy Jack came out, and I remember seeing it. There were TV commercials everywhere, and I went to the drive-in and saw it. These were the first really martial arts movies. And everybody loved the fighting, which attracted people, and he had a very strong American Indian message there, although he had no American Indian blood whatsoever. But he was a very great man, and had a lot of important information, and put that actually on the screen. And after his first movie success, he was highly harassed, and the film industry, which likes to be bleeding heart liberals, made sure that they did not support him and were pressurized, as so many of them are, by government people to not let this get out. So that is a fascinating story unto itself. As I said, there's 4 movies, I believe, and you should get those in the set and listen to those commentaries, which are fascinating, of what kind of harassment he went into. And again, this wasn't in the year 2000, 2005, or whatever. This was happening in the 70s, where you had this high degree of corruption going on, which has got nothing but worse since, and how the participation of so-called law enforcement and the military. So it's all pretty shocking, people. And it's not new. This is what happens when you allow this in your community and you work with them, because you are greedy or don't have the courage to fight against these kind of people. So this is documented, and there's a lot of these, but someone who can actually bring up a tornado and cause this kind of effect is quite fascinating. Now, the bottom line is that being able to do this consistently, being able to do this in war situations, never has seemed to have been the case. And one of the, quote, rubs again. Let's talk about it. The fact is that the Druids were known to do this stuff, but the Druids were massacred by the Romans. They obviously were unable to fight a superior army. When it comes down to it, the superior military force always wins, no matter what their belief system is. The Romans were originally pagans, and they conquered the world with those gods and belief systems. The Roman Empire continued to do this under Christianity and ultimately fell under Christianity. But we go on and on to those people who have won or conquered large areas of land in the world, and they've all been different religions, and so there isn't certainly one dominant force, and none of these people to save them. The Egyptians weren't saved by their gods, the Greeks weren't saved by their gods, the Romans weren't saved by their gods ultimately either. So all of these things is the bigger rub of what this means, and the power of individual medicine men or shamans cannot overcome the bigger problems of what's going on. Maybe you can be decisive in a single battle, maybe you can help in certain areas, maybe you can heal people, bring up storms for crops, but if you're going to be doing this in a conquering and for war situations, it's not something that can be done consistently and effectively, so it appears. So, because there is just no proof that this has worked with any society whatsoever. All societies, or I should say all groups of people, have won because of their superior military technology, whether that's the Huns or anybody else. So that's the sad fact of that. But there are many cases of this shown in this book and documented consistently. Now, there really isn't any practices here that as a person seeking, well, what are the techniques to do this? How do you control weather? He claimed in his book that actually using beetles, we've seen these beetles, he was able to cause rain. A lot of things seem to be very based on their connection to the general energies and not specific practices. He states himself, which any real teaching person will do, I do it myself, is that, well, we give you the basics. Don't copy me. Find out what works for you. And I think this is very true. He trained his family to do things, and they were unable to do so many things that he did. His children, his sons, well, they didn't have much power, and they weren't able to do too much. So as we get involved in all these things, we need to understand that. So he had his way, he had his high-level communication. I'm not sure there's an ABC technique to doing everything. He himself, when was told of other people that had powers, he asked for the techniques, which I find interesting. What was this mantra to control this animal that he was told about an Indian guru was able to do? Yet, this information, of course, the author who witnessed this, who wrote this book as well, never had any of this detailed information. So, really poor scholarship. But if you go in awe of people, if you're not looking, and it's not a negativity, we're trying to get to the truth here. If you can produce something and do it in a, quote, repeatable fashion, well, then there should be something to it, and you should be able to put somebody to the wall and say, do it. So, other than that, it gets to be so speculative, so problematical, and there has to be a certain repeatability to things and a certain method of doing things. Of course, there are some elements, using energies, actually sucking energies at a person is part of this tradition. The use of tobacco is a big part of it, which is used in a lot of different cultures. I should say in cultures that are North American and Caribbean based and South American. So the Mexicans and the places where the tobacco came from and the Caribbean all use tobacco as something to communicate with and thank the spirits for. So tobacco is a big thing, but there is no intrinsic empowerments in tobacco, even though it's used through these ceremonies. So we're not really sure what value it has, but it certainly is used and well known to be used in voodoo and other traditions. Voodoo, hoodoo has always been using these, and that is part of their practices. Now, does that attract spirits? Smoke is a way of communicating on a lesser dense level with spirits, so it could have an element of attraction there and so forth. But there isn't any great words of power, any particular chanting, and you got to remember that no cultures really want to give this information to people who are hostile and murdering them. One thing that a lot of pagans or alternative people in our society is the people that you are around are not your friends. If they had their chance, your average Christian in America, they would cut your throat. You would be murdered and thrown in prison. You're a nut job. You're a psycho. They're not your friends. So for him to share his empowerment, he talks about in this book, this is not really the time for it. And so he wanted to show that there was power there, but he was not going to go out and teach people, particularly the white man, the ways of the Indians. This is very true throughout any training orders, that people don't really want to share their secrets, not necessarily because there's some danger in knowing it, but it does empower people who are basically your enemies. Why would you want to do that? Makes no sense. This is very typical in most traditions, particularly from the Asian traditions, meaning the Japanese, the Chinese. Well, they don't teach white man much past the basics, and they keep all the good stuff for themselves. Now, I don't know how it is in India with the gurus, but I'm sure it's similar there as well. They may want your, as most gurus do, they want your wallet and your girlfriend or husband or whatever. But how much they really give you or even respect you as a Westerner is highly in question. Now, as we come to the end here, I could talk about this for hours. There has been, as usual, of people like this. There's been a great discrediting of this individual, stating he wasn't an Indian, he was a white man, etc. He was doing this for whatever money. Well, this is nonsense, and there's no way. The fact that he should go out and prove he's an Indian. He was accepted by a society. He worked with all the chiefs of the areas. He worked with other medicine men because it's difficult even to trace somebody's birth. Birth records and everything else aren't really all that great until relatively recent years. He was accepted by, he was proven to be a powerful person. It's almost, not almost, it's very insulting to the Native Americans. The fact is that this wasn't a Native American, it was some white guy. Well, he did an awful lot of good work, an awful lot of healing, and had an awful lot of power that has been demonstrated time and time again. And he certainly had a large Native American following. But the typical discrediting goes on. Anybody who's trying to do things, and particularly is radically trying to change things, like he tried to do, stopping a big government, is going to have their bought and paid for traitors from their own culture and in general that go after him. And this is one of the major attacks on this person. And so what if he was or not? But there's certainly, I'm sure, it could be confirmed that this person had some of this heritage. But as we know, with the Mormons who are stealing children and interbreeding them as it goes, this is a major problem. As I mentioned, you're not going to see a red man in an Indian tribe in California. They all look like Mexicans. This is where the culture. So they're not red men. Certainly not most California tribes. So it doesn't even have that classical look. And you're talking about now a fairly long period of time of inbreeding where people are quite different. And all of, like so many black people and the Indians as well, they all have these basically British, Western European names that were forced upon them. So they're trying to discredit him in all these areas, trying to say he was a fake and everything else. But it's proven time and time again with this person by many credible people that he had power. One of the problems with people is, as I said, whether they're observers or writers, is they tend to be too glorifying the great Indian warrior in front of me, the great shaman. They tend to give these people too much credit and too much respect. You always need to be, as occult scientists understand, is to question everything. Don't give anybody any credit for anything. You're not hostile towards anything, nor are you believing in anything. It's the golden mean, people. If someone has power, you will see it. If they are just BSing and the local people drool at them that they're these great mystics, like they did with the diaper-wearing Indian gurus who were 90% lies and cons, who, as Rajneesh did, who had, I don't know, 8 or 10 Rolls Royces that drove around and basically was running a sex commune and apparently had enough financial support to do that. These are the kind of frauds that people buy into. It's always good to tie a little sex or drugs into something and throw in some philosophy so people feel like, oh, well, I'm here for the philosophy. I read Playboy for the articles. So the whole idea is that this kind of thing has to be guarded against as a researcher. And very few people can do that because they're not too happy with their own society and reject it, and they feel these people have been persecuted, which they have. But that doesn't give them a right to overly glorify or give over credit to these people. So you've always got, what is the facts here? What is going on? Does this person really have some level of empowerment? And you have to watch things carefully to prove this, or it could be just delusional with everyone. Did something happen or not? We're talking about some pretty radical things that happen here. If someone is healed, they're healed. So they've been disgraced him. Apparently there's some talk that one of his older sons is a pedophile. We don't know if any of this is true. There's a lot of reports of it, but this is very typical of the disgracing of people and the disgracing of Rolling Thunder by disgracing his family. Well, his kid is bad, he's bad. Now, we don't know if that's the case either. This is very typical of a paid Black Lodge criminal group of people that go out to any people, and particularly the Native Americans, who they want to steal everything that they have. And their land still will actually trump up these things, pay people off, and everything else. So it's very difficult to prove. On the other hand, you're not responsible ultimately for your children. If they have some strange perversion or other things, are involved in criminal activity, well, it doesn't say much for your parenting, but it is unknown what the facts of this are. And he's had several children, but apparently one of them is a problem. Don't know if there's any truth to that. But this is the typical way that people slur and hurt true people of empowerment. This happens with any real people. Fake organizations, fake people are supported, they're glorified, and they are empowered both directly and indirectly, and they have lots and lots of money come to them mysteriously, like, of course, the international satanic movement, which is highly funded by criminal elements and who are active in all of your lives and who work within criminal gangs throughout the world, and these criminal gangs which are supported by their buddies and pals, otherwise known as your local police department, who allow them to operate because they get paid. So we just don't know what the true story there is. Now here's a quick rub as we get into this particular area here. He only lived to be 80 years old. his first wife died of cancer. Well, what happened? No healing there. So this is what you see in so many things. There's the Christian faith healer, a guy called Benny Hinn. I'm assuming people have heard about that. His brother is a horrible diabetic, and he can't cure him. That's the way it is. So what are these rubs? Now, he apparently, because 80 years old is pretty young. The average life expectancy is 78 years old in the United States right at this particular time. So he lived what you would call an average life expectancy. Now, for a person who had great knowledge of healing herbs, healing powers, but what people don't understand with these rubs is that when you help people, you take on their illnesses, which tend to make you sick, and you may not. And if you do this consistently, it's hard for your own body to fight these things. Now, apparently, which is even more ironic, is that he was a diabetic. He died of complications of diabetes, so it says on line. Now, I don't know, again, if this is true or not. I'm assuming statements like that. He also had emphysema, breathing conditions. Well, he did smoke a lot, and he apparently smoked toxic American tobaccos. He didn't have natural tobaccos. He lived under, like so many people did, under what I call the Elvis Presley syndrome. He thought that he could neutralize those poisons in his system, and maybe did it to some degree, but not enough. It's kind of silly to think that way. Elvis Presley thought he could eat pounds and pounds of very fatty foods and that he wouldn't gain weight because his mind controlled it. But apparently he was sick as well. As the true story there is that he probably had liver cancer, so one book states. But so here we get this. First of all, his wife died of cancer, and who was in great pain and everything else, and apparently he was unable to heal her. What's going on there? These are always the things that bother me, and I always look for this in people's lives. Well, prove to me your life is better. If you're going to be a great healer, well, why are the people? But, that is not necessarily true, and people who are teachers and who can help others may not be following the path that they state. Do as I say, not as I do, and I think while that may be contradictory, I think it's really true in people's lives. It's also hard to, saving the world is easy. Saving your own family and your own self is a lot harder. And as I said, this is for a bigger discussion. But apparently that is the case. Now, I don't know what other problems his, and I don't know if this one problem child's been brought up, if there was anything done, and if there was any exorcisms done on him by Rolling Thunder or not. But he seems to have had these children very late in life. At least this child, that's under question. But here we go again. Here he died at a very common age. Not young, not old. Pretty much everybody lives to that age. He has a condition. You think that he would find natural herbs, treatments, and spirits that would cure him. Same thing happened with Carl Castaneda's, who died of liver cancer. Well, he couldn't talk to that. Same thing with that complete con, the Terence McKenna, who died of brain tumors. Yet he talked to the spirits all the time. So the whole idea is that it is important to understand all these facts that is out there. And these are always the things that always rattle my cage the most, is this contradiction in people's lives. I mean, here's a guy who's dedicated his life to a medicine man, to heal people, to do healing, healed other people, yet his wife he couldn't heal. Is this an ironicy? Is this some sort of ultimate joke by the spirits? Is this the price you pay for power? Well, There's always a price to pay, it seems, in this reality, because we are living in the hell plane. So you're not going to just be made a great healer, live to 150, cure all your relatives, your pets, and everything else, and everything's going to work perfect for you. Well, there's really no case of that from anyone, anywhere. None of that has been shown from, quote, holy men who have not really lived that long and have been that prosperous on any level. Here's just another very dramatic situation. You would think that something as relatively simplistic as diabetes would be something that, and he talked about helping and curing people that had diabetes in this particular book. And of course, this book written in the 60s, he was not afflicted by that disease. I don't know if smoking brought that on or the consumption of different food products, which there seems to be links to meat preservatives and diabetes, sodium nitrates, which I'm sure he consumed because he was living on regular foods and maybe didn't know the best, even though he talked about eating pure. He talked about all this diet and everything else and how bad all these things were, yet he has something, developed a disease which is oftentimes linked to diet. I don't know if he was smoking pure tobacco. Apparently not. Sometimes he talked about having pure tobacco, but again, the author is not a very good reference to this. So here we go again, and this is always the mind-boggling thing. Was this a price he had to pay? Was this the reality that he had to face? But here's something that you have to really question. Why wasn't he able to control his diabetic condition using natural herbs? And there certainly is a lot of herbal treatments for this condition. Why wasn't he able to heal himself with something that I feel is something that can be relatively assisted? Now, we don't really know what causes this. As I said, these toxins cause these conditions. They like to say it's the rich man's disease. You get diabetes because you eat a bunch of fancy foods. Well, that's not really true. People get diabetes that not necessarily eating high sugar diets or even high carbohydrate diets. It may be linked to a virus, or I believe everything is linked to some sort of virus, fungus, etc. That causes this within the body. Now, where do these come from? Well, we don't know. But it certainly is interesting. And of course, he doesn't live on a different planet. He is exposed to the toxins and other things that are out there. He was under great stress in his life. He was constantly under attack, constantly harassed. As I said, the documentation of how they used to harass him at his home. They kidnapped and murdered some of his dogs. The real evil stuff that people used to do, and of course are well known to do it. He was cited for dogs were used as protection, but they couldn't roam around because the police hassled him about doing that, even though this was something he needed for security. His cars were vandalized. All these things happened in this area of northern Nevada where he lived, a place called Carlin, where he set up also a little community there. But this particular book is written about a segment of his life, and a lot of what he was involved in this new community is not covered. It wasn't formed as of this time, because this is the end of the 60s. A lot of things started to happen in the mid-70s and into the 80s, where he formed this whole community and apparently was working quite well. People were living there. He was doing well, which is the smart thing to do. Where you generate your own people, your own protection, and live in your own realities. So not that much is known about it. I haven't done research in that area. I do have a follow-up book on him I'm reading, and probably will read a few others. But this gives the basic understanding of what happens, and ultimately, kind of in a nutshell, of what happened to him, how he actually died from complications of emphysema, which is a lung disease problem, probably because he did smoke quite a bit. Here again, he couldn't cure himself. what it says on Wikipedia is he died from complications of diabetes. But here again, when you're taking in a bunch of negative energies, healing, toxic, deadly energies, evil energies from other people, they enter your body. And no matter what you do to cleanse them out, this is one of the problems with healers, and one of the very serious problems with psychics in general, particularly female psychics, who instead of understanding how to open themselves up, they bring energy into them, and they work through emotional levels, which females are notorious for. But these emotional levels of energies affect you dramatically physically, which is why so many female psychics tend to get sick and die in their middle to late 50s, plain and simple. This is something I've looked into and have followed for many years, and it seems to be very true. Being a female psychic is something that is very dangerous to your physical reality, and this is so true. But it's the same thing with anybody who are healers. We look at healers in the radionic tradition, and almost all radionic practitioners have died young. So what is this all about? And it goes to a lot of healing practitioners in general. Why are they dying very young? You would think they'd have the technology to empower themselves. But you also tend to get into the rut, as I myself, as a teacher and ritual worker, have done, is, you're too busy helping other people to help yourself. You don't want to deal with your own problems. You want to deal with your own illnesses, so you tend to ignore them. Well, I got to work on this other guy. I don't have time to work on me. And of course, so this is all part of it. So I don't know what happened in his later life and so forth, but this doesn't bode well for him in terms of the bigger picture. But this is very typical in terms of spiritual people in general. They are not superhuman. You may have certain abilities, psychic or otherwise, but that doesn't mean that you can conquer your own life, live forever, or have a continual Superman-like reality. I mean, that's why they're in comic books. You take off the glasses and the business suit and the big S on your chest, and you're instantly now Superman, and there's no work involved, no nothing, and so forth. This is very typical about comic book superheroes. None of them did anything to perfect their abilities. They have given abilities, which is what we all want. I don't want to work. I don't want to meditate. I don't want to practice. I want to be Superman. So this is where everyone comes from, so I certainly understand that. Now, that's not the case with so many other practitioners that understand you have to do this. When you start using more energy-based systems and clear yourself out better, which is what a lot of Qi practitioners and Asians do, they tend to live a lot longer. Plain and simple. I haven't heard too many cases of Qi practitioners, Qi Kung people from the Asian traditions that die young, even though they heal a lot of people. They're more conscious of that, and they seem to work on that. And they work on it directly, while maybe Rolling Thunder thought the spirits would take care of him, and they didn't. So, other things to take into consideration is a lot of things that all of us don't understand. He may have been deliberately targeted, so may have his wife, using psychotronic weapons to murder him and his wife. Wouldn't be surprised. This stuff is real, people. He was a person that they wanted to get rid of. They want to discredit. They may be mind controlling. If this son of his is a problem, they may be mind controlling him to be a pedophile. These things are facts, people. It's a sad and dangerous and really screwed up world out there. And unfortunately, the ability to attack people with psychotronic weapons and give them diseases and to pervert their mind and cause them to do things is real. It's been proven. We've posted many of these things on our website. It's unfortunately a fact. So, he was targeted. Well, I know that from all the harassment. How further this went, maybe he was lucky to live to be 80 because of being targeted, and his spirits and his energy kept him alive as long. After all, they did murder one of his first wife. So, as we get involved in all that, that's part of the reality that we need to look at as well. We can't look at these things from such a straight line, a straight level of understanding that these things are not part of what we know now as part of this world and what people do to those who are troublemakers or who they've targeted for one reason or another. So we just don't know. But certainly, regardless of, we certainly can't condemn his entire lifestyle because he died at a common age from what is a common affliction. That doesn't in any way disregard the amazing things that he's been credited of doing, and many of which, by numerous numbers, have been witnessed by a lot of people and a lot of credible people. So, from many areas that have come in contact with him, everyone has a story of this guy doing something. So the point is, he was a powerful man. The fact he couldn't necessarily save himself or his wife in a longer picture is just one of those higher spiritual understandings that we must contemplate and figure. But needless to say, this was a real person. All evidence points that he definitely was an American native. This was not some white man. How insulting that is. Even if it was, so what? This person had power, demonstrated it, and actively tried to help people, formed a community, did the best he could, and lived a pretty good life. And lived that at a fair amount of time involved in it. So, as usual, people, the secrets of the universe are not given to you because in a book, life is this constant struggle, and we keep seeking gnosis, seeking truth, and once we reach that, of course, then we know all.